All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 13, Section 3, Reforms to Human Health. So just recall, we are in the antebellum period, so that's right before the Civil War. And one of the major reform movements was the movement for temperance, that is to get rid of alcohol. Or alcohol or liquor being kind of the big problem. It's not that alcohol was new. There were some things that were making the problem worse. Urbanization was making it worse. Now, drunkenness was more public. You could go outside and see it. You could see it on the streets. You could see it in the workplace. Whereas when it was rural, when it was happening on farms, it wasn't quite as visible. And then you also had the market revolution, which simply just made alcohol more available. Remember, the market revolution was the change where farmers went from growing things to consume it to growing things to sell it, alcohol being one of it. So alcohol was more readily available, it was stronger, and because you lived in these more densely urban areas, it became a bigger problem. And so when people looked at the problem, especially in northern cities, well, alcohol seemed to be underlying a lot of those problems. If you get rid of the alcohol, you can get rid of some of the crime, you get rid of spousal abuse, you get rid of the neglect that children have. And so that's why there was a major kind of movement to, get rid of this in the United States. Most of this was led by Protestant ministers. So the temperance movement has kind of a deep roots in religiosity. Lehman Beecher was one of these Protestant ministers. He gave sermons on the evils of alcohol. Right. So this was a very strong religious slant to it. And you can see some of the temperance literature and propaganda here. This is called The Drunkard's Progress, where it shows the effects of alcohol on an individual from, happiness up here down eventually to suicide, and of course the wife and the child who is the most neglected in this situation or scenario. And so different organizations formed in an effort to try to get rid of alcohol. The American Temperance Society tended to be more middle class, tended to be more Protestant, and focused more on things like laws. The Temperance Society practiced teetotalism, which was the complete prohibition of all alcoholic drinks. Actually, temperance at the time, temperance today means prohibiting alcohol, getting rid of all alcohol completely. But at the time, it had only meant things like spirits, right? Which is like whiskey, stuff like that. That beer and wine, for the most part, beer and wine were seen as okay, right? So get rid of spirits, no whiskey, no, bourbon, stuff like that. Beer and wine were generally considered okay, but teetotalism said no, right? Beer and wine are not okay, even though the alcohol content is a little bit lower and it doesn't quite affect your, your mind and your physical characteristics that much. We have to get rid of that as well. So the Temperance Society was one organization that fought against alcohol. Another one was the Washington Temperance Society. This was a little bit different. It was a little bit more, we might call working class. It was a little bit more, immigrant, which tended to be more Catholic. And instead of focusing on the laws, it really kind of focused on the person. So for example, there was people would take a pledge that they would abstain from alcohol. It really wasn't interested in trying to get laws passed making it illegal. It was more of like, okay, I'm going to take control of my life and I'm going to pledge not to use alcohol. So these were kind of two of the main societies. And, the temperance movement battled it out over states and counties in the United States. A wet city or a wet county or a wet state was one where alcohol was legal, and a dry county or a dry state was where alcohol was illegal, as you might guess it. And so there were fights going on at the local level, and the temperance movement was successful in getting some local laws passed prohibiting or banning alcohol on, again, just kind of a local state town level. There were also some other reforms. I would say that temperance was a much larger reform throughout the United States, but there are also others that focused on things like health. Sylvester Graham was somebody who promoted something like healthy eating, for example. This was not a very health conscious time period, but the effects that things like pollution had and poor nutrition and disease, human beings in cities just looked weak, and the idea of eating healthy and abstaining from certain things like alcohol, like red meat, you began to hear some people speaking out on topics of health, like Sylvester Graham. Phrenology was the study of the mind, and you see a picture here, kind of like psychology in some ways. And this was kind of a, more people became interested in this as a way of trying to improve one's health.